Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Knowledge and Decisions, a book that I think will really change how you see the world around you. It's a dense book, but fascinating. And I've got our expert here to help us break it down.
It's a book that really makes you question everything you think you know about how decisions are made. And not just in economics, but in every aspect of society.
Exactly. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick overview? What are the big themes Sowell tackles?
Well, Sowell's main argument is that knowledge is the key ingredient in any decision. But it's dispersed throughout society. No single person has all the answers. And so he explores how different institutions, from markets to governments, gather and use this scattered knowledge. And he looks at the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. He argues that systems that allow for individual decision-making and utilize price signals are far more efficient than centralized planning. And he's very critical of the role of intellectuals in pushing for solutions that often ignore the realities of limited knowledge and individual incentives.
Okay, so basically it's about how we make good decisions when nobody has the full picture. That's pretty relevant to, well, everything. Where do we even begin unpacking all that?
Well, Sowell starts by laying out his core premise. Decisions are all about trade-offs. Every decision, whether it's what to have for dinner or how to run a country, involves weighing costs and benefits. And the key to making good decisions is having the right knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense. But as you said, nobody has all the knowledge. So how do we even begin to make good decisions?
That's the million-dollar question. And Sowell argues that the way we organize ourselves, the institutions we create, have a huge impact on how effectively we use the knowledge that is available. He uses a really interesting comparison. He talks about a primitive savage who needs to know everything for survival. They have to build their own shelter, hunt for their own food, defend themselves from predators.
Right, because they're completely on their own. No supermarkets or hospitals for them.
Exactly. They can't specialize because they don't have the social structures to support it. Now, contrast that with someone in a modern society. They can focus on a very specific field like neurosurgery or computer programming because they can rely on others for everything else. This specialization is only possible because we've developed systems for coordinating knowledge and effort.
So the savage is like a centralized planner trying to do everything themselves and failing miserably because they just can't handle it all. But a modern society is more like a market where everyone contributes their own little piece of knowledge. And we somehow manage to function as a whole.
That's a great way to put it. And Sowell argues that market-based systems, which rely on price signals, are particularly good at using this dispersed knowledge.
Prices as signals, what does that even mean?
Think about it like this. Imagine you're at the grocery store and you see that the price of oranges has gone up. You don't need to know why the price has gone up. Maybe there was a frost in Florida. Maybe there's a shortage of truck drivers. Or maybe people are just suddenly craving more orange juice. Whatever the reason, the price increase tells you that oranges are relatively more scarce than they were before.
So the price is like a little piece of information, telling me something about the world without me needing to read a whole report on the citrus industry.
Exactly. And because of that price increase, you might decide to buy fewer oranges, or you might switch to apples instead. The point is, you're adjusting your behavior based on the information contained in the price, without needing to know the underlying reasons.
That's pretty cool. It's like the market is having a conversation with us through these price fluctuations, telling us what's going on.
And Sowell argues that this conversation is much more efficient than any kind of centralized planning. Because no matter how smart they are, central planners can't possibly have all the information needed to make optimal decisions for an entire economy. They can't know the individual preferences and circumstances of millions of people.
But doesn't it kind of assume that everyone is perfectly rational and always acts in their own best interest? What about things like emotional spending or irrational exuberance?
Sowell acknowledges that people aren't always rational, but he argues that markets work not because individuals are perfect decision makers, but because they create a system where even bad decisions tend to get corrected over time. When people make bad decisions, they suffer the consequences, which means they're less likely to make the same mistake again. And the market as a whole learns from those mistakes.
So it's like a process of trial and error, but on a massive scale.
Precisely. And that's why Sowell argues that markets are so powerful. They allow for a constant process of adaptation and learning, without any single person or entity needing to be in control.
Okay, so we've got this idea of dispersed knowledge and prices as signals. How does that connect to Sowell's critique of government intervention?
Well, Sowell argues that when governments intervene in markets, they often disrupt these price signals and distort the flow of information.
So it's like the government is trying to speak over the market,
Yeah.
but it's only making things more confusing.
Exactly. And Sowell gives a bunch of examples of how this can lead to unintended consequences. One of his most famous critiques is of rent control. The intention behind rent control is to make housing more affordable for low-income renters. But Sowell argues that by capping rents below market rates, you actually end up discouraging new construction and reducing the overall supply of housing.
So instead of helping people, it actually makes things worse.
That's often the case, according to Sowell. Because when you distort the price signal, you're essentially telling property owners that it's no longer profitable to build or maintain rental units. So over time, the quality of housing deteriorates and you end up with shortages. It's a classic example of how good intentions can lead to bad outcomes when you ignore the basic principles of economics.
So what does Sowell propose as a solution? Just let the market run wild and hope for the best.
That's a bit of a simplification. Sowell acknowledges that markets aren't perfect and that there are legitimate reasons for government intervention in some cases, but he argues that we should be very cautious about interfering with market mechanisms, and we should always be aware of the potential unintended consequences. He believes that in many cases, the best solutions are those that empower individuals and families to make their own choices, rather than relying on government bureaucrats to decide what's best for them.
Okay, so he's not a complete libertarian, but he's definitely skeptical of big government solutions.
Exactly. He's a strong advocate for individual freedom and responsibility, and he believes that free markets are the best way to harness the power of dispersed knowledge and create a prosperous society.
And he really digs into the idea that people respond to incentives, not just good intentions.
Absolutely. In fact, one of his most famous quotes is, "The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics."
Wow, that's pretty cynical, but also kind of funny.
So Sowell is known for his wit and his ability to cut through the rhetoric and expose the often unseen consequences of policies.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this book has been so influential. It's like he's giving us a whole new way of looking at the world.
He really is, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
Let's keep digging then.
You know, one of the things that really struck me about knowledge and decisions is how Sowell challenges us to think about knowledge itself. It's not just about facts and figures, but about understanding the limits of what we can know and how we use the knowledge we have.
That reminds me of his concept of the physical fallacy. Do you remind me what that was about again?
Yeah, so this is where Sowell gets into the subjective nature of value. He says we tend to focus on the physical properties of things, the concrete, measurable aspects, rather than the subjective values people place on them.
Can you give me like a real-world example? That sounds pretty abstract.
Sure. Think about something like a diamond. We know it's a piece of carbon, right? We can measure its size and clarity. But its value comes from the meaning we attach to it, its beauty, its rarity, its symbolic significance. Sowell argues that ignoring these subjective values leads to all sorts of problems.
Okay, I'm starting to see what he means. So how does this physical fallacy play out in, say, economics or policy?
Well, Sowell uses the example of medieval just price doctrines. These were attempts to set prices based on some objective measure of the cost of production, ignoring the role of supply and demand. But value is ultimately in the eye of the beholder, and trying to dictate it from above just doesn't work.
So kind of like those price controls we talked about earlier, messing with the natural signals of the market.
Exactly. So Sowell would say that's a perfect example of the physical fallacy in action. Another great illustration is his discussion of usury laws. For centuries, there were prohibitions against lending money at interest. These laws were based on the idea that charging interest was inherently immoral, exploiting the borrower.
But today, lending money at interest is, well, the entire foundation of our financial system. What changed?
Well, Sowell argues that as societies became more sophisticated, we started to understand the subjective value of time. The lender is foregoing the use of their money for a period of time. And they're taking on the risk that the borrower might not repay them. Interest is the compensation for that risk and for the lost opportunity.
So the just price of a loan isn't just about the amount of money being lent, but about the value of the time and risk involved. That's actually a really profound point when you think about it.
It is. And it shows how our understanding of value can evolve over time.
So we can't just look at the physical aspects of things. We have to consider the intangible values people attach to them. That's a big shift in perspective.
And it has huge implications for how we think about everything from economics to social policy.
Okay, so the physical fallacy is all about the subjective nature of value. What about this idea of the limits of articulation? That sounds like a mouthful.
Yeah, this is another one of Sowell's key concepts, and it's closely related to the idea of dispersed knowledge. Sowell argues that a lot of knowledge is tacit, meaning it can't be easily expressed in words or formulas. It's the kind of knowledge you gain through experience, through trial and error, through intuition.
Okay, so like I can read a book about how to ride a bike, but that doesn't mean I actually know how to ride one until I get on and try it myself. Exactly. Or think about trying to explain to someone how to bake your grandmother's famous cookies. You might have the recipe written down, but there are all sorts of little nuances, little tricks of the trade that are hard to articulate.
So this kind of knowledge is really important, but it's also really hard to capture and transmit. How does that affect the way we make decisions?
Well, Sowell argues that it makes centralized planning even more problematic because central planners are relying on articulated knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can be written down in reports and regulations. But they're often missing out on the vast amount of tacit knowledge that exists throughout society.
So trying to regulate something as complex as the economy is like trying to write down the recipe for your grandmother's cookies. You're going to miss all those little details that make it special.
That's a great way to put it. And this is why Sowell is so critical of regulations that attempt to define and control every aspect of production. He argues that these regulations often stifle innovation and lead to quality deterioration because producers are forced to follow a rigid set of rules that don't capture the full complexity of the situation.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You might be able to force it in, but it's not going to be a good fit.
Exactly. And it's this kind of thinking that leads Sowell to advocate for more decentralized systems, systems that allow for experimentation, adaptation, and learning from mistakes.
So less top-down control and more bottom-up innovation.
Precisely. And he sees market mechanisms as a prime example of this kind of decentralized system. Because in a market, people are free to experiment, to try new things, to fail, and learn from their mistakes. And the information about what works and what doesn't work is transmitted through prices and other market signals.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just about individual freedom. It's about creating a system that allows for the most effective use of all the knowledge that's out there.
Exactly. And that's why Sowell sees individual freedom as so essential. Because when people are free to make their own choices, they're also free to learn and adapt and to contribute their own unique knowledge to the collective good.
Okay, so we've talked about the physical fallacy and the limits of articulation. Is there another big Sowell concept we need to unpack before we wrap up this deep dive?
There is one more key idea I think is crucial to understanding Sowell's work, and that's his perspective on the role of time in decision-making.
Time. What does that have to do with anything?
Sowell argues that different actors in society has different time horizons, and this has a huge impact on the decisions they make. He contrasts the short-term focus of politicians with the longer-term perspectives of voters and interest groups.
Okay, so politicians are thinking about the next election, while voters are thinking about their kids' futures.
Exactly. And this difference in time horizons can lead to a disconnect between what's good for the country in the long run and what's politically expedient in the short term. Sowell argues that political incentives often lead to policies that provide immediate benefits, even if those benefits come at the expense of long-term costs that will be borne by future generations.
It's like eating all your candy now and getting a tummy ache later,
Yeah,
except on a societal scale.
that's a great analogy. And Sowell would say this short-term thinking is a major reason why governments are so often prone to making bad decisions.
But isn't that just human nature? We all tend to prioritize the present over the future.
Of course we do. But Sowell's point is that the structure of political systems often exacerbates this tendency. He argues that because politicians are constantly seeking re-election, they have a strong incentive to focus on policies that deliver visible results in the short term, even if those policies are unsustainable in the long run.
So what's the solution? How do we encourage policymakers to think about the long-term consequences of their actions?
That's a tough one. Sowell doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does suggest that we need to be more aware of this problem and to hold our leaders accountable for making decisions that are in the best interests of the country as a whole, not just their own political careers.
That sounds like a tall order, but it's definitely something worth striving for. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Dispersed knowledge, price signals, the physical fallacy, the limits of articulation, and the role of time in decision-making. Is there anything else we need to hit before we move on?
I think there's one more crucial aspect of Sowell's work we need to discuss. His critique of the role of intellectuals in shaping public policy.
Ooh, this sounds juicy. Tell me more.
Sowell argues that intellectuals, with their focus on abstract ideas and grand visions, often advocate for policies that sound good in theory, but fail to account for the complexities of the real world.
So they're kind of like those central planners we talked about earlier, thinking they can design the perfect system from the top down.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Sowell believes intellectuals often overestimate their own knowledge and underestimate the importance of dispersed, practical knowledge held by individuals throughout society. They can fall prey to what he calls the fatal conceit, believing they can engineer social outcomes that are better than what would emerge organically from the interactions of millions of individuals making their own choices.
That reminds me of his critique of the welfare state. He seems to think it's well-intentioned, but ultimately creates more problems than it solves.
You've hit on a key point. Sowell isn't arguing against helping the poor, but he questions the effectiveness of many government programs designed to do so. He argues these programs can disincentivize work, create dependency, and ultimately trap people in a cycle of poverty.
He seems to think individual initiative and responsibility are key.
Right.
Right. That resonates with his emphasis on free markets and limited government.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Sowell is a strong advocate for individual empowerment and sees the expansion of the welfare state as a threat to that. He's not heartless, but he believes that long-term solutions to poverty lie in fostering self-reliance and creating opportunities for people to lift themselves up, rather than relying on government handouts.
It's a provocative stance.
Yeah.
And I can see how it could be controversial.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
Sowell's work often challenges conventional wisdom and pushes people to reconsider their assumptions about the role of government in society. He's not afraid to go against the grain, which is why his writing is so thought-provoking.
Well, thinking critically about these issues is what this deep dive is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's not about agreeing with everything Sowell says, but engaging with his ideas and seeing how they might change our own understanding of the world.
Exactly. And Knowledge and Decisions provides a powerful framework for doing just that. Sowell encourages us to think beyond simple solutions and easy answers, to consider the unintended consequences of our actions, and to appreciate the complexity of the systems we live in.
You know, one thing that really stands out to me after reading this book is the importance of humility. Sowell seems to be saying that none of us have all the answers, and we should be wary of anyone who claims they do.
That's a profound takeaway. And it's a valuable lesson not just for policymakers, but for all of us. As we navigate a world overflowing with information and conflicting opinions, Knowledge and Decisions reminds us that true knowledge comes from acknowledging the limits of what we know and being open to learning from others, from experience, and from the often unpredictable outcomes of our actions.
It's a call to be more thoughtful, more skeptical, and more willing to engage in respectful debate even when we disagree.
Precisely. And ultimately, it's a reminder that freedom, responsibility, and a healthy dose of humility are essential ingredients for a thriving society.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking this dense but brilliant book. What's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
I think the most important thing Sowell wants us to remember is that knowledge is dispersed. It's out there in the minds and experiences of millions of individuals, systems that allow for that knowledge to flow freely through mechanisms like prices and voluntary exchange, are ultimately far more effective at solving problems and creating prosperity than systems that rely on centralized control.
So less top-down control, more bottom-up innovation, and a healthy respect for the limits of our own knowledge.
Exactly. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Knowledge and Decisions. We hope you found it enlightening and thought-provoking.
If this book sparked your interest, I highly recommend checking it out for yourself. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep those brain cells firing.